Hello everyone, my name is Xerri and I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm going to be focusing on the notion of teacher creativity, but perhaps I'd better start by addressing the notion of creativity in education more generally. A number of writers and researchers have commented on the fact that creativity seems to be something that gets killed much more often than it gets supported. Those are the words of Teresa Amabile at the University of Harvard. And we've all heard Ken Robinson's talk on creativity and how he talks about that we're all born with deep natural capacities for creativity, and systems of mass education seem to suppress them. The use of words like killed and suppress are obviously very negative, and this makes us think about why creativity seems to be something that is being undermined by the educational system. My creativity research over the past few years has taken me to different countries where I've spoken to teachers, teacher educators, poets, storytellers, children's authors. I've spoken to people who manage creativity organizations, and I've also spoken to students, and I've observed students participating in creativity workshops at their own schools. However, one thing that I've come across is that the conceptions that people have with respect to creativity very much affects what they do in their own profession, in their own education, and it can either encourage them to engage in creative thinking and creative practices, or else it can hinder them from seeing themselves as people who have innate creativity. So perhaps we need to start by asking ourselves, what is creativity? What is this notion that some people seem to believe belongs to everyone, and others seem to think is only associated with a select few? And if we look at the standard definition of creativity that is found in the creativity research literature, sometimes this seems to be considered as having two sides to it. So it's something associated with originality. So for something to be creative, it has to be unusual, it has to be novel or unique. And the other aspect is effectiveness. So the standard definition also sees creativity as something that is useful, is appropriate, has value. However, when we see creativity in that way only, and we underscore the value of originality, what we tend to forget is that not all creativity needs to be about the creation of something out of nothing. And in fact, when we consider some of the most common myths about creativity, some of the most common misconceptions about creativity, one of them is the originality myth. The idea that creativity is only about the creation of something out of nothing. Another powerful myth that has been around for centuries is the one called the breed myth. And Burkus, in his book on the myth of creativity, talks about how some people believe that in order for you to be creative, you need to have been born creative. So in order for you to become a poet, you need to have been born a poet. And if you haven't been born a poet, then you're never going to be able to write good poetry. And this is something that I've come across in my research as well. And it's a misconception shared by teachers and students around the world. Unfortunately, when we have such misconceptions about creativity, what ends up happening is that we discourage our students from actually being creative. So that's a very important idea. And it leads us to consider that perhaps creativity is something different. Something, as Chas Pugliese describes it, dynamic. A dynamic concept. It is not unique to certain individuals, and it is not genetically learned, as he says. It is something that belongs to everyone. And if it belongs to everyone, that means we can instill it in our own students. In fact, in a recent publication, Tessa Woodward talks about the need to redefine creativity. And if we manage to redefine creativity, what we end up doing is we're giving ourselves time, space, and permission to play with the notion of creativity. And as educators, we're also enabling our students to do the same kind of thing. And in the process, we discover that we have the freedom, and we're giving others the freedom to be creative. And these ideas hark back to many other thinkers and researchers. For example, if we go to the work of Arthur Koestler, in his book The Creative Act, he comes up with the notion of dissociative thinking, which basically entails the formation of a new matrix of meaning through the act of combining elements from previously unconnected matrices of thought. The idea here is that you combine things which you might not have previously seen as capable of combination. So creativity is not only about creating something out of nothing, but it's also about establishing connections, building bridges between different disciplines, between different sets of materials. And when we start seeing creativity as a combinatory act, or as Einstein describes it, a combinatory play, an act of combinatory play, then we realize that creativity can lead us to do things which we might not have previously seen as creative. And this leads us to the notion of multimodality, for example. So when we combine texts with sound, with images, we are creating multimodal products. Those multimodal products are a creative act. And let us not forget that multimodality and a multimodal approach to education entails the crafted integration of different modes of meaning, as Dressman would describe it. If we move on to consider creativity within education, we can start thinking about what different authors and different educators have said. And here I'm going to refer to a few people whom I've interviewed in the course of my creativity research. For example, the children's author Libby Gleeson, an author based in Australia, talks about the fact that in education most often we come across these statements about the value of creativity, about the value of encouraging young people to be creative, to be imaginative, and to develop as creative beings. But at the same time, she questions about what is being done in the classroom to encourage creativity. So if we believe so powerfully in creativity, if we believe in it in terms of policy documents, in terms of curricula, what is happening on the ground? What is happening in the classroom in order for us to encourage young people to be creative? And these are ideas that lead us to consider the notion of creativity training, creativity education. If we start with teacher education, perhaps focusing on creativity in pre-service teacher education may enable us to ultimately produce teachers who can position themselves as creative practitioners. And creative practitioners are individuals who not only have learned the techniques to actually be creative in the classroom, but they also have the capacity to encourage the students to be creative. So creative practitioners are people who see themselves as capable of being creative, but they also have the skills and knowledge to encourage others to be creative. And an educator and a spoken word artist based in Northern Ireland, Shelley McClear, does this with the young people and the teachers that she works with in Northern Ireland. So when she does workshops with students, she encourages teachers to participate in those workshops because she believes that there's always room to learn and to be creative. So she does this because she knows that teachers are ultimately the best role models for their students. And if students see the teachers positioning themselves as creative individuals, as people who are willing to take risks and be creative and share their creativity, then this is obviously going to be motivating for the students. Similarly, Richard Short, who is the chief storyteller at an organization called the Sydney Story Factory in Australia, talks about how in teacher education, pre-service teachers might hear quite a lot about the importance of encouraging young people to be creative. But then, when those teachers enter the classroom for the first time, one of the first things that slides away, he says, is the creative aspect. And this is because teachers end up being overwhelmed by the demands of the curriculum, and especially by an assessment-driven culture. And one of the things that I'd like to conclude with is reference to another spoken word artist whom I observed working with young people in Australia, working with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And after I interviewed her, I realized that we, as educators, if we believe in our ability to be creative and to encourage other people to be creative, we can actually make a difference. And in the interview, she told me that when you give people the tools to express themselves, to activate their voice and combat the idea of voice poverty, then what you're doing is empowering young people. You're empowering them immediately, and you're also empowering them much further down the line. So creativity and creativity education can be a form of empowerment for young people. And if we want to actually see ourselves not only as teachers of a language, but see ourselves as teachers of a very important 21st century skill, then we need to insist on the value of creativity and to see ourselves as people who can actually do this. And to quote two Harvard researchers, Reimers and Chung, this entails learning new ways. We as educators, we as teacher educators, we as students, we need to learn new ways. We need to perhaps reconceptualize what creativity is and rethink our own role with respect to creativity. Thank you so much.